Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. We, of course, have been discussing the events that are taking place in the High Middle Ages with church reform and politics. And now we will move into what's called the later Middle Ages, or as our lecture is titled, The Crisis of the 14th Century. This very calamitous, very bad 14th century in Europe. It was not a very pleasant time to be alive. And with this upcoming lecture, of course, quite a lot of very devastating events are occurring in Europe in the later Middle Ages. You have what's called a little ice age, which will hurt crop production, which obviously will affect food supply, which in turn will cause people to starve. And then you have on top of that a bubonic plague. It's called the Black Death that will just ravage the European continent here in the later Middle Ages. It comes in waves. It will come, it will devastate the populations. No one was immune from it. Rich, poor, old, young, healthy, it doesn't matter. It does not discriminate against the people that it will affect. And the thing about it was people didn't know how they were getting it at first. Priests would wear these very scary looking bird masks to administer last rites, if they even did that. We're going to see eventually everybody's just going to run for their lives. Parents are abandoning their kids. Bodies are being burned. If they're, taken, parents, people are trying to escape this very horrifying death. And so it comes in waves, and it'll reemerge a few years down the road. And so we have this little ice age. We also will see this Black Death that is ravaging Europe, killing quite a few people. We'll notice too during the later Middle Ages that the aristocracy, the nobility, will start to dress more elaborately. It's kind of like they were trying to distance themselves from reality. They hold these great banquets and feasts, trying to, I guess, again, distance themselves from reality. And we'll also see a lot of the artwork of the time period. It's very grim, very dark sort of artwork with the Grim Reaper. And in one instance where you'd have maybe the Virgin Mary, she's all peaceful and smiling and wonderful and lovely, you'll see her weeping in tears, you can see that the times are not good at all just through the artwork of the period. Also with the later Middle Ages, you think that when you have the Ice Age and harvests aren't as good and you have the Black Death, you also see a lot of revolts occurring. The English Peasants' Revolt in England, 14th century. You have a peasant revolt in France called the Jacquerie or the Jacquerie in the 14th century. And you even have warfare that will erupt in the later Middle Ages. It's called the 100 Years' War, although it really wasn't just 100 years. It was actually a little bit longer, and we didn't see fighting every single day. Can you imagine fighting every single day for over 100 years? But it was to the point where we can encompass all of this activity in one war. And it was between England and France. And the war was fought only on French soil. So you can imagine how devastating that would have been to the French peasants, because they're going to suffer the most, because it's their land that will be destroyed, their houses that will be burned, their livestock that will be taken, etc., etc. So warfare, revolts, Black Death, poor harvest. Then, of course, people, usually in times of trouble and strife, people will say, let me look to the church, maybe find some peace, find some spirituality, something to get me through these very, very tough times. Well, the church was in turmoil in the 14th century. or the later Middle Ages. We notice the church is falling apart. We have, of course, the Great Schism that takes place, where there will end up being 3 popes. Once one pope is elected by the College of Cardinals, they tried to depose him and elect another pope. Well, the first pope said, "I'm not stepping down." And this cycle will continue, and you would think it would be over if one pope died. It wasn't. It was a continual cycle there for quite a while. And it kept going on because European countries would support one or the other pope. I had mentioned in a previous lecture that we had one pope that resided, usually a French pope, in Avignon, which is within, it's kind of like a papal city, but within France. And then you had another pope, usually Italian, that would reside in Rome. And at one point, the College of Cardinals elected another, trying to depose both those popes, get rid of them, and have one. You had 3 popes because the other 2 wouldn't step down. So it's absolute chaos. We're seeing corruption, illiteracy on the part of priests, people that were trying to look to maybe their local priest for guidance, are finding them to be illiterate, corrupt. In general, I'm not talking about every single priest that existed in the 14th century. But overall, the church's image is very damaged. And it's not until the secular, the worldly governments of Europe band together and say, we will support this one pope, that we see that things are going to get a little bit better. So the church is actually going through a crisis as well. And we also have a civil war that will occur in England. It's called the War of the Roses. So those are pretty much just a few of the very calamitous events that are occurring in the 14th century or the later Middle Ages, hence the title of this lecture, The Crisis of the 14th Century. So let's learn more about what's happening during this period.
Hi. Today we're going to talk about the crises of the 14th century. And when we think about it from a historiographical perspective, the 14th century wasn't a very kind century to Europe. In fact, it was a series of catastrophes that we often refer to as the general crises of the 14th century. But what happens is around the year 1300, Europe reaches a population of probably 80 to 85 million people. And that is the largest population that Europe could maintain at that time without new agricultural technology or without new inventions that allowed people to use the land more readily. We've seen the period roughly 1000 to the year 1300 was a period of great growth in Europe. We have the reemergence of cities, we have the emergence of early nation states, we have all of these other factors which come into play. We have changes in agricultural technology, the transition from a 2-field to a 3-field agricultural system, which gave people a better diet, which gave them a good combination between carbohydrates and proteins. We've also seen the use of horses in agriculture. We've seen the invention of the horseshoe in the new horse collar, or the yoke collar, which allowed horses to be used effectively in agriculture for the first time. And what this did is this reduced the amount of time that people had to use in agriculture, because hitherto the standard draft animal had been the oxen, which of course was slower and not as smart as the horse. So we have the introduction of horses, we have the transition to the 3-field system of agriculture, and between the years 1000 and 1300, Europe grows. So we've got a surging population, probably an increase from 30 million to 80 to 85 million people. But what happens is Europe reaches something which is called the Malthusian barrier. And this, of course, is named after the economist and social theorist Thomas Malthus. And what he argues is that population increases exponentially, whereas population increases arithmetically. That is, population increases 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, but changes in food technology only increase arithmetically. So if you come up with a new system of fertilization, if you come up with a new system of crop rotation, that'll only be able to help you increase the food 1, 2, 3, 4. So gradually what's going to happen is the population is naturally going to outpace the food supply. And so the population is going to continue to grow, whereas there won't be enough food to feed people. And this is precisely what happens around the year 1300. We'll have the beginning of this population crisis, which will affect all segments of society. So around 1300, Europe's at roughly 80 to 85 million people, and that really is the maximum threshold. So as a result, you could expect that there probably were a lot of people living on the brink of starvation anyways. This is exacerbated by the fact that around the year 1300, there's a mini ice age, and that is the overall temperature of Europe declines by about 1 degree Celsius. Now, 1 degree Celsius isn't a major drop, but what it does is that it shortens the growing seasons, and it brings areas that had been previously marginal. It takes them out of the equation altogether. So as an example, the Vikings had initially settled the coast of Greenland. These areas, eventually have to be abandoned because they're no longer suitable for agriculture. And in other areas, say in Switzerland, many of the glaciers start to come down, and something similar happens in Scandinavia as well. So areas which were marginally suitable for agriculture are now completely out of the equation. So we have a large population. With this change in temperature, we have even less land that's under cultivation. So you can see we have the beginning of a very serious population crisis. This population crisis is likewise exacerbated by strange weather patterns that occur throughout the 1310s. And beginning around 1315, 1316, and then lasting into the 1320s, we have a pattern of strange weather systems that will disrupt most of Northern Europe. And what happens is in the spring, as people prepare to plant, we have heavy thunderstorms that come through. And what they do is they completely flood areas, and so the spring crops simply cannot be planted. This pattern begins 1315, 16, but then it continues, and it continues, and it continues. So what happens is we have a period of 4 to 5 years with very, very heavy rains. And the very, very heavy rains means that you simply can't plant your crop. And the crop that you try to plant simply won't grow. So as a result, not only do we have Europe on the threshold with a population of 85 million, but we have this mini ice age. We have a temperature shift downwards by about 1 degree Celsius. But now we have these strange weather patterns which affect the land even more. And as a result, we have mass starvation. This occurs all throughout Northern Europe. It affects Northern Europe far more than it does Southern Europe, but it swings across from Russia into Poland, into the Empire, Low Countries, Northern France, and England and Ireland. And you can imagine very desperate situation, people on the brink of starvation anyways, and now there's no crop, so there's no food. So this begins what's known as the Great Famine. And the Great Famine is a result of these strange weather patterns of the 13 teens into the 1320s. That is the heavy spring thunderstorms which make the land unusable. And as a result, we have mass starvation. We have mass starvation which probably reduces the overall population of Europe by about 10%. And all kinds of dreadful stories. Cities, of course, were hit very, very hard, especially in the Low Countries, because there's simply no food to buy. In the countryside, we hear stories of cannibalism, of people eating anything to be able to survive. Even stories of people burying up the dead from cemeteries to try to eat them. So really, really graphic and gruesome stories that people on the edge of survival do very, very desperate things. But this Great Famine throughout the 13 teens and 1320s probably kills about 10% of Europe's population. So it hits Northern Europe the worst in this band from the Baltic across the North Sea. Northern Europe is hit very, very hard by this Great Famine. The other factor, too, is those people who survive are chronically malnourished. And so those people who make it through the Great Famine have very, very poorly developed immune systems. And what that means is that will prevent them from being able to deal with immunological problems. And that will be part of the next demographic crisis that we'll have in the 14th century. And what happens is beginning in 1347 and lasting until roughly 1351, we will have what's known as the Black Death. And the Black Death is a combination of various factors, but it's best known as the bubonic plague, although that's only one variety of this Black Death that's out there. And what happens is this form of plague had hit Europe before. It had hit Europe in the 6th century during the reign of the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, and is often referred to as Justinian's plague. But nevertheless, Europe had been relatively plague-free for about 800 years, and so most people didn't have any type of immunity to this Black Death when it did return. Now, there are multiple stories about the arrival of the Black Death, where it came from, how it happened, but the typical story goes like this. Genoese merchants are in the Black Sea, and they have a base on the Crimean Peninsula. And they get into a fight with the locals. And the locals are steppe peoples who had come across the Eurasian steppe. And the steppe peoples have some type of affliction. And their bodies, become infected, and many of them die. And what they do is they torture the Genoese by throwing the dead bodies over the wall into their fort, their compound. And so these Genoese merchants become infected with this Black Death, although they don't know what it is. They leave the Crimea and then they sail to Constantinople, where, of course, Constantinople is affected by this Black Death as well. And then this Genoese death ship continues to travel. It goes to Sicily, then it bounces around the ports of the Italian peninsula, but everywhere it goes, the chronicles tell us, it brings the death with it. And so every port it stops at, it spreads this death. And the death ship is responsible in 1347 for bringing the Black Death into Western Europe. Now the story, that particular story is facile, and the reality is much more complicated. But we know in 1347 the Black Death does hit Europe again, and we can trace it. We could trace the development and progression of the Black Death from the Mediterranean across the Alps into Northern Europe and into England and Ireland as well. And so it does follow certain patterns. Where does it come from? Well, the bubonic variety of the Black Death is actually the least toxic of all these Black Death varieties that we'll see. There are 3. The bubonic plague is the least toxic, and when I say the least toxic, that means it's only going to kill about 50 to 60% of its victims. So it's got a mortality rate of about 50%. The Black Death, the bubonic variety, is spread by fleas. And they're fleas that live on the black rat, the Rattus rattus, the standard European house rat. But what they do is the fleas get on human beings and they transmit the bubonic plague to the human being. And the telltale sign is the lymph nodes, the buboes, swell. And the bubonic variety of the Black Death attacks the lymphatic system. It attacks the lymph nodes. As we've seen, the mortality rate is 50 to 60%. You can live, okay? But it's not, well, I guess you've got a 50% chance. But death comes pretty quickly. Death's within 2 to 3 days. So death comes pretty quickly. But if you get hit with the bubonic variety, there's a 50% chance that you're going to die. There are 2 other varieties as well. There's the pneumonic variety, which of course is spread from human to human through sneezing. It's a respiratory ailment. It's an infection in the respiratory system, and usually you will die within 1 to 2 days. So it, again, is a rapid killer. It kills about 95 to 100% of its victims, so its mortality rate is quite high. If you get the bubonic variety, there's a possibility that you can live, but if you contract the pneumonic variety, it's very, very unlikely that you'll live. And as you can imagine, cities were particularly dangerous areas for the pneumonic variety because you have so many people in close contact, in close quarters. The third variety is the septicemic, and it's a blood disorder, which is a mutation of the bubonic variety. It is 100% fatal, and it's the type of illness that causes convulsions within hours, and you can die within the day. So the typical Black Death story of the guy who gets up and goes to work and doesn't feel well and comes home and is dead is usually a septicemic variety. But all of these are very, very fatal. We've seen bubonic 50 to 60% fatal, pneumonic almost 100, septicemic 100. And Europeans had no real immunity to these because the last time the bubonic variety had arrived was 800 years earlier. And also as a result of the Great Famine, Europeans have underdeveloped immune systems, and so they're already in a weakened state. So the mortality rates across Europe are going to be very, very high. And in fact, 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe will die as a result of this Black Death. Now, some areas are harder hit than others. In general, cities are hit very, very hard, as we've seen, because you have so many people who are in close proximity. And so cities will have to come up with various type of quarantine conditions. Again, you can imagine just the demographic catastrophe we have. How do you dispose of the dead bodies? What do you do? Do you give them Christian burials? Can the priest bless them? Nobody wants to be around these bodies. And so many people, especially the wealthier, try to flee the cities. They flee the cities to go to the countryside because the common belief is that when the plague hit, the air was poisoned. So there's bad air. So you need to go somewhere where the air is good. And one such story is Boccaccio's Decameron are plague stories that people tell. They're Florentines who fled the city. They fled the city and gone to the countryside to get better air, and they tell stories to pass the time away until it's safe to return to the city because the air is bad. 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe will die, and the first big outbreak is 1347 to 1351. But the fact remains that the Black Death is a fact of life in Europe, and it will be throughout the remainder of the medieval and early modern period. In fact, the last major outbreak in Europe is in the 18th century in southern France. In the 17th century, there was a major outbreak in England. But it becomes a fact of life, and it's recurrent. And that is every 20 years or so, it'll come back. Generally, the first outbreak, the 14th century one, is the most fatal because it kills between 1/3 to 1/2 of the people. Future outbreaks aren't as lethal because usually they will hit the weaker members of society. So generally the very young and the very old, but those people in the middle will usually be okay. But the plague becomes a normal feature of European life. We have a severe demographic crisis in the 14th century as a result, but it's also a recurrent one. People need to think about new and different ways of dealing with this threat. And what it means. And you can imagine if you woke up and all of a sudden 1/3 to 1/2 of all the people are dead, you're going to try to seek solace somewhere and try to explain it somehow. And to many people it seemed like the wrath of God, but somehow we've done something very, very wrong and God is punishing us. So it's some type of judgment by God. Different cultures treated the plague differently. And in the Arab world, in North Africa, many people saw it as a gift, that it was an opportunity to be taken away to paradise. In Christendom, though, the view was a lot more negative because it was seen as something really horrible, that somehow we'd done something very, very wrong and that we were being judged by God by means of these calamities. One of the effects of the Black Death is that cities shrink. Population loss 1/3 to 1/2. Cities shrink across Europe. Although oddly, some cities seem to have been spared. So it travels in this fairly rapid circuit. So it does escape some areas, but cities overall shrink, as you can imagine. Families shrink. The idea that the plague is the wrath of God causes many people to rethink their relationship with the church. And as we'll see in the 14th century, there are serious problems within the church because we have, for much of the 14th century, popes in Avignon and then eventually 2 popes. So people began to think that somehow the church had failed the people and Christendom wasn't providing the help and the protection that it should. So it helps in the creation of this overall gloom, and people began to look more outside of orthodox and organizational ecclesiastical outlets and start to think about heresy and mysticism and other non-traditional forms of religion. One such group in particular are called the Flagellants, and what they saw themselves as kind of foci of God's anger, and they would travel throughout cities whipping themselves as a form of punishment. And the flagella is a whip in Latin, so flagellants. And at first, people supported them, but gradually they became very, very radical, and eventually the whole movement's condemned by the papacy. So there were various different types of responses to the Black Death, as you can imagine. One very unfortunate response is, of course, anti-Semitism, and there were new pogroms against the Jews. The story began to circulate that the Black Death started because Jews had poisoned the water supply. And once this rumor began to circulate, people began to gang up and kill Jews. In fact, the papacy had to order people to stop it because you didn't need to be a rocket scientist. All you had to do was look around, and you could see that the Black Death killed Christians and Jews. Everybody suffered from it, so it was therefore ludicrous to try to blame it on one particular group. But throughout most of the medieval period, the Jews were the only significant religious minority in most of Western Europe, with the exception of Spain, and so therefore they were often labeled as scapegoats during these periods. There was a sense of general malaise and uneasiness that set in Europe, and this can be seen in lots of different ways, but it can be seen in peasant revolts, and there will be a variety of peasant revolts throughout Europe. There's a major one in England in 1381, there's a major one in France at the Jacquerie in the 1350s, and even in the cities we'll have urban revolts. And so one of the ways that people react to the Black Death is by revolting against those people who are in power. So we'll have peasant revolts, we'll have the proletariat within the cities revolt against their urban overlords. Because it seems as if society has been turned upside down, that all of a sudden all these people die, and how do you explain it? Now, on a positive side, serfs are placed in better bargaining positions because there's simply not as many of them to go around, and so they can demand better working conditions, and we have attempts by monarchs to try to regulate prices and wages and to intervene to try to preserve the social structure to make sure that society doesn't deteriorate too much. But the massive loss of people leads to all kinds of disturbances in societies. Overall, though, the Black Death helps to reduce serfdom in Europe. Because the population is hit so hard, as we've seen, serfs are in better bargaining positions. But this demographic crisis hits everybody across the board. Nobody's immune from it. It hits poor, it hits rich, and it hits everybody in between. And what it does is it makes Europeans death-obsessed. And it can be seen in the literature, it can be seen in the artwork, it can be seen in the sculpture, that people become more interested in the idea of the dying human body. People become interested in how to prepare how to die. And we see a genre of literature, how to die well, how to prepare oneself for dying. A lot of the common things, the Grim Reaper, these images are really images that come out of the 14th century and the Black Death, and different ways that people try to deal with their changing circumstances. So Europeans overall become kind of a death-obsessed culture. And again, there's increasing pressure on the church to do something about it. Now, the University of Paris, the Faculty of Medicine there, ruled that it was an unusual conjunction of the planets Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, I think in the constellation of Sagittarius, that caused it. So that was the best scientific explanation that people had at that time. Nobody knew what caused the Black Death. The air had gone bad was the common explanation. So really, faced with all of this, the crisis, people often looked to the church for help. And often the church couldn't respond because the clergy was hit pretty hard. First of all, monasteries were hit very, very hard. And then the clergy were hit hard too because they were usually the first to tend to the ill, and so they contracted the plague. And so during times of crisis, you might turn to your priest and discover that your priest is gone. Well, you might think that your priest disappeared, but chances were pretty good that your priest was already dead. And so the Black Death really helps incur this kind of wave of anti-clericalism as people blame the church and its own shortcomings on these new realities. So the first crisis of the 14th century we have is the demographic one. And we see first the Great Famine and the Black Death. So we have an overall reduction of Europe's population by somewhere around 1/2 or 50%. So we're close to maybe the 45 million ballpark. The second great conflict of the 4th century is known as the Great Schism. Now, this particular schism doesn't concern the schism between Constantinople and Rome. Rather, it concerns the Great Schism within the Western Church. And this is what happens. It begins for political reasons, but gradually it devolves into an ecclesiastical nightmare, which confuses Christians. And it begins back even into the 13th century. And it begins with the King of France. And he is Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. And Philip the Fair in France is considering war with England again. England still controls Gascony. And so Philip is starting to reignite hostilities with England. And he's thinking about ways that he can fund an English campaign. And so he's thinking of new and innovative ways to get money. And one of the things that he decides is he should tax his clergy, because after all, they are Frenchmen. He taxes other Frenchmen, so French clergy shouldn't be exempt from his taxation. Now, previously, popes had allowed monarchs to tax the clergy, but usually for a crusade. There has to be some type of good religious reason. And if Philip is going to go to war against England, this certainly can't be called a crusade because the King of England is a Christian king. But Philip IV is considering war with England, and he wants to tax the clergy. And he attempts to do so, and the Pope at the time, Boniface VIII, tells him clearly no. And what he does is he responds with a bull. A papal bull is a letter, but he responds with a papal bull, and the first one is called Clericos Laicis. And papal bulls are labeled by the first two words. But what he does, Boniface threatens Philip the Fair with excommunication, which would cut him off from the sacraments, and then also interdiction. And interdiction is a particularly nasty ecclesiastical weapon because it prohibits you from celebrating sacraments in a geographical area. So it doesn't affect one particular person, it affects a larger geographical area. What Philip does when he receives threatening letters or threatening language from Boniface VIII is that he responds and he says, well, wait a second, you know, France, we're the wealthiest country, and what I'm going to do is if you persist in this behavior, I'm going to prevent money leaving the French kingdom from going to Rome. That is, I'm going to threaten the papacy with economic sanctions. Boniface begins to reconsider his position. He backs down a little bit. France is a very wealthy and populous country, and Boniface was preparing for the year 1300. And the year 1300 was the Catholic Church's first Jubilee event. And so he wanted to make sure that the money and the pilgrims came to the city of Rome and that he didn't do anything to jeopardize it. And so he hems and haws, and Boniface eventually drops the issue. He mends fence with Philip IV of France and tells him, well, okay, kings can tax clergy under exceptional circumstances, but he allows Philip to define what the exceptional circumstances are. And so the year 1300 comes and goes, and the Jubilee event was wonderful at Rome. Many pilgrims came, much money flowed into the Roman coffers, and so Boniface is a very happy pope. And in the beginning of the 14th century, we're going to start to see an emergence of quarrels between Philip and Boniface. And what Philip does, Philip IV of France, is that he partially instigates them. There's a series of incidents where he'll have ecclesiastics arrested and charges, you know, trumped up, and but Boniface sees what's going on, and so Boniface begins to threaten him again. And in the year 1302, Boniface issues the papal bull known as Unum Sanctum. And this bull is significant because it's a very, very strong statement against secular authority. And it essentially says that spiritual authority is always stronger than secular authority, and the spiritual always judges the temporal. That is a very, very big view of church and state, whereas church is always above the state, and Boniface is judging Philip. Okay? So Boniface is threatening Philip, is judging him, and he's telling him that he is greater than Philip because he's the Pope, and so he essentially is more powerful than the King of France. And you can imagine Philip was fairly angered. And what he does is he summons, for the first time in the history of France, an assembly called the Estates General. Now, the Estates General contained representatives from the three estates, that is, the clergy, the nobles, and the bourgeoisie. And these three estates assembled in Paris. And what Philip wanted was to get some reaction from the population. How do you feel about this? I'm being threatened by the Pope. Will you support me? So 1303, the Estates General summoned. 1303, he sends letters out to everybody at the University of Paris asking them, do you side with me or do you side with the Pope? And of course, all those who sided with the Pope were kicked out of the University of Paris for a year. So Philip galvanizes his support. He has his propaganda ministers doctor letters from Boniface to make it sound like they're saying something that they didn't, saying that maybe Boniface is claiming that he's king of France. And so really he gets the entire French population galvanized, and they're very, very upset at Boniface. Moreover, in kind of a Becket-type style, he says, I wish somebody would do something about Boniface. And it just so happens that two of his courtiers go to Italy, and they find Boniface at his, excuse me, his headquarters at Ignagne. And Boniface at this point is about 80 years old, but they threaten him, they place him under house arrest, they slap him around a little bit until they're eventually run off. But the furor and the excitement of the whole event was a little bit too much for Boniface, and Boniface immediately has a heart attack and dies. So Boniface is threatened from courtiers of Philip IV, and in the ensuing melee, Boniface dies. So we'll have a rapid election of popes. We'll have one pope who dies shortly, then another one who's elected, who takes the name Clement V. Now, Clement V was from Bordeaux, right? Now, the city of Bordeaux was technically in Gascony, so it was an area that was under English political rule, but it's an area that was under French cultural influence. So one of the reasons that Clement is elected pope is, the idea that maybe he could placate Philip IV. And there are lots of agreements between Clement and Philip because, of course, Philip wants Boniface condemned, Clement wants Philip's courtiers condemned, and so there's a lot of negotiation going back and forth. But because of the hostility in Italy and the political disturbances, what Clement does is he moves his administration from Italy to the town of Avignon. Now, technically, Avignon was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's on the Rhone River, but again, it's an area that's surrounded by French cultural influence and language. So essentially, Clement moves the papacy into a French-friendly area, and it was intended to be a very temporary move. And he moves in 1305. So what happens is, as you can imagine, the papacy increasingly falls under French influence. And from 1305 to 1376, all popes will reside at Avignon, which means that more and more of the cardinals within the College of Cardinals who are selected are French. So the French begin to dominate the College of Cardinals, which means that they will control the papacy for about a 70-year period. So the papacy is conquered by the Capetians. And increasingly, most people thought that the move would be a temporary one, but the second Avignonese Pope, John XXII, actually begins to build the Palais du Pape, or the Papal Palace. And of course, once you're building a papal palace in Avignon, it becomes pretty evident to everyone that the papacy is not moving back to Italy anytime soon. So the papacy increasingly becomes dominated by the French. The papacy will follow the lead of the French kings, and one such event concerns the trial of the Templars, because the kings of France move against the Templars and confiscate their estates and order an investigation, which the Pope is forced to do, and then eventually suppress the order of the Templars. So increasingly Rome falls under the domination of French kings and under the sway of French politics. This makes many people unhappy, especially in Italy, because the papacy should be in Rome, is the view of many Italians and many Romans. It also is confusing to a lot of people. Why is the papacy in Avignon? I mean, popes have lived in other areas for a while, but now we have a permanent palace. And popes are living in Avignon just at the same time as the plague hits. So we have the Black Death, we've got the bubonic plague, and many people, the world is upside down anyways, and the simplest explanation is, how could this happen? Well, it can happen because the popes aren't in Rome. So many people were very upset by this papal vacancy from Italy, and the popes are put under enormous pressure to move back. Increasingly, people write letters. There's a letter writing campaign. People begin to travel to Avignon to try to pressure the popes. And you can imagine Avignon becomes like a little Rome because of all the papal business. So all the administrators are there. The College of Cardinals is there. The ambassadors, the legates. So Avignon becomes a very important city politically. But also the the popes in Avignon need money. And hitherto, a good portion of papal revenue came from the papal states. And once you're in Avignon, the papal states will become completely decentralized and become a breeding ground for mercenaries and kind of a no man's land politically. And you can't administer the Papal States when you're in Avignon. So central Italy deteriorates politically and becomes a kind of a Wild West type territory, which means that the popes in Avignon can't get any revenue from that area. So the popes have to come up with new and innovative ways to try to get money. And so the Avignonese popes are desperate for money, and so they come up with new ways and new systems. And there's many type of financial abuses that do occur with the Avignonese popes, and it becomes complicated because the spiritual and the temporal interests of popes are often conflated, and so that often, the popes will select you to be an archbishop or bishop if you can pay a certain amount of money, an annate. Often this is when they start to see the abuse of indulgences because there's a real need for the Avignonese popes to get money. Nevertheless, they are under enormous pressure to move back to Rome, and it is in 1376 that Pope Gregory IX decides that he's going to take the plunge. He makes preparations, he gets ready to move back to Rome, and he does, and promptly dies. And we have another papal vacancy. So this is 1378. And the College of Cardinals meets in conclave, and the city of Rome breaks out in a riot. The cardinals are trying to vote, and there's a riot in the streets. The Italians inform the cardinals that they can't be protected. They threaten them and say, you must elect an Italian. We want a Roman, but we'll put up with an Italian. And so there's enormous pressure on the cardinals to elect somebody who's Italian. And so as they meet, there's people screaming and rioting, so they're trying to vote in this type of situation. They select the Archbishop of Bari. They select an Italian, and just as they do, the mob breaks into the conclave, and the cardinals have to run out, and they're afraid for their safety. They're afraid they're going to get killed in the streets. But they do elect an Italian. And immediately what happens is he makes it clear that he's going to reform the College of Cardinals, that he doesn't like the French cardinals. He's going to appoint a bunch of Italian ones. He insults many of the cardinals. And increasingly, the cardinals are furious with their choice. And what they do is many of them begin to migrate outside of Rome because they didn't see Rome as a very safe place. They first migrate outside the city of Rome, and then they return to Avignon. And they agree that their election wasn't a fair election because they were under duress. They were physically being threatened by the Roman population. So they made this choice under duress, and they said that Urban V, the new pope in Rome, wasn't a valid pope, and so they elected their own. So in 1378, we have two popes. We have one pope in Avignon and one pope in Rome. And your political allegiance determines which pope you'll follow. So if you're the King of France, you're going to adhere to the Avignonese pope. If you're the King of England, you're going to follow the Roman pope. Okay, so if you're Scottish, you're going to follow the Avignonese pope. So politically, the allegiances were divided. And so, again, all of Europe's thrown upside down because we've got two popes. And even worse, we've got two popes who need money. And so a lot of the confusion between the spiritual and the temporal interests of the church become even more complex because now we have two College of Cardinals, we have two curias, we've got two papal systems of administration in place, both of which are very, very costly. And so from 1378 to 1409, we'll have two popes. And so we have the line at Avignon, we have the line at Rome. Now, many people are disgusted with this situation and just think it's ridiculous. There's two people claiming to be pope. There's one vicar of Christ, there's one vicar of Peter, there can't be two. So there's a lot of discussion about what to do. And many academics, largely coming from the University of Paris, but many academics, intellectuals begin to sit down and think about ways to deal with this issue. And the most logical way, they think, is to call a council, a church council. And so they will attempt to do this in 1409. In 1409, some of the greatest thinkers of the day get together, and they will meet in the city of Pisa. And they will encourage the Roman Pope and the Avignonese popes to abdicate, and they will elect a new one. So in 1409, we have a new pope created at Pisa. However, the two popes at Avignon and Rome refused to abdicate. So from 1409 until 1415, we'll have three popes. The Pisan pope is very little political support, because essentially he's a creation of intellectuals. But again, Europe is even more confused spiritually because we have 3 people claiming to be Pope. Now, by now the situation had become intolerable. And actually, it's the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, who's able to use his influence to call another church council. And he appeals to the model of the early church when emperors, Roman emperors, called church councils. And using his influence, he is able to get actually representatives from the Iberian Peninsula, from England and France and Italy, all in the same room to talk about church matters. And they realize that there's serious problems in the church, but problem number 1 is to deal with the problem of 3 popes. So he assembles representatives at Constance, and from 1414 to 1417 we'll have a council at Constance. And the first thing it does is it issues a decree, Haec Sancta Synoda, that explains to everyone that the council's authority comes directly from God. So in the future, don't try to argue against this council, because our authority comes from God. So Haec Sancta Synoda. Then it proceeds to depose all 3 popes. It deposes 3 popes, and it will elect a new one. And the new pope has to agree, because the council's meeting, and it can only deal with this really important problem. The new pope has to agree that he will have councils at regular intervals, so 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. And these councils will help treat all the problems in the church, the financial problems, the administrative problems, problems of doctrine. And this movement's called conciliarism, the idea that the council could be greater than the pope. And what Constance tried to do was actually create kind of like a legislative body that will supervise the pope. And so that's the attempt that we have at Constance. And of course, the new pope agrees. But generally, after Constance, popes don't like councils. And what they'll do is, when they'll call a council, they'll try to translate it to another city, or say, oh, wait, there's a plague in this town, or I'm busy now, I can't meet, or hey, we've got representatives from Constantinople, let's talk about church unification. And so most of the councils after Constance are failures, and by the end of the 15th century, popes deem it heretical to say that a council is greater than the pope. So Constance brings us back to 1 pope, so we're down to 1 pope in Rome, but we still have multiple problems in the church in terms of the conflation of political and temporal and spiritual interests. So the problems really haven't been resolved, and the goal was to have different councils to try to address these different issues. And so there were many issues of church reform that hadn't been addressed, but the popes are very, very unlikely to call a council, because the first thing the council tries to do is take authority away from the pope. The final crisis that we have in the 14th century is, of course, a very, very long war between England and France. And it's not one war, it's rather a series of wars. And it's a series of wars that takes place. They will have some campaigns, we'll have a long period when there's no active campaigning, then we'll have more campaigns, so on. But this long war between England and France is known as the 100 Years' War, although it lasts much longer than 100 years, as it begins in 1337 and it lasts until 1453. And we've seen before some of the background factors going back to the beginning of the 100 Years' War. There had been conflict between France and England for a very, very long time, going back to William the Conqueror's conquest of England, because remember, he was the feudal vassal of the King of France. It's exacerbated when Eleanor of Aquitaine has her marriage annulled with Louis VII, and then marries Henry, who becomes Henry II of England in 1154, which brings large areas of France under direct English rule. And there's really continual conflict between England and France until 1259, and that's when Louis IX of France, St. Louis, makes peace with Henry III. And so really from 1066 to 1259, we have a lot of conflict between England and France. Now, one of the strengths of the Capetian monarchy was its ability not just to ally with the church, but its ability to produce sons. And the Capetians reigned on the average for about 20 years. So we have a stable period of Capetian rule, but we also have an heir, because there's always a son. And what happens when there's no son? And when there's no son, there will be the 100 Years' War. And here's what happens. In 1316, Louis X dies without any heirs. And what will happen is the Capetian line will jump around to brothers. And it does that until there's no more brothers. Okay? Now, as it turns out, the closest heir to the last Capetian is Edward II of England, because Louis X's sister, Isabella of France, had married Edward II. So if the throne could go through the female line, Edward II would have the best claim to the throne, and then Edward III, their son, would become king of England and France together. And so that was one problem that that had never been an issue before for the Capetians. And so many people stopped to think, and all the political theorists, well, can this happen? Can this not happen? And eventually, in France, the political theorists come up with an idea called Salic law. And they're really appealing to the past and grasping at straws. But it's a legal iteration that comes from the ancient Salic law code of the Salian Franks that says that women, the throne can't go through the female line, that it only can go through a son. So no female can inherit the throne. So unlike England, France had never had a sole female ruler. England had had the experience of Matilda. France hadn't, although France had had plenty of female regents, but never women who ruled by themselves. And so what the nobles do is they go to a cadet branch of the Capetians, and they elect Philip VI from the House of Valois, who takes the throne. So we have a new dynasty. And Edward in England at first does feudal homage for his territories in France, for Gascony. But then when Philip's ministers want Edward to come back and do a more proper homage, a liege homage, he refuses and then openly announces his claim to the throne of France in 1337. And it's an unusual war because it lasts from 1337 to 1453. All the battles are fought in French territory. France loses almost all the major battles but ends up winning the war. And here's what happens. In 1337, Edward openly announces his claim to the throne. The first major battle in the Hundred Years' War is in 1346, and the English, in an expedition in Normandy, actually, get trapped by the French at Crécy. And it's at Crécy where the English used the longbow on the continent for the first time, that the English had been used to using the longbow from the Welsh. The French still were fighting in a very traditional way, cavalry, and of course they hired Genoese bowmen. And the English longbow, as the French tried to challenge the English position in Crécy, the fortified position, that the longbow just came down and slaughtered the French. And of course, the French cavalry overran the Genoese, and so Crécy was a huge victory for the English. That was 1346. The next major battle isn't until 1356, a decade later, and it's the Battle of Poitiers. And it's an unusual battle because, again, the English win. They capture most of the flower of French chivalry, and even the French king himself, John II, who agrees to go as a hostage to England and lives under a very nice house arrest and has a very active social life. He eventually returns to France, and his son's supposed to go in his stead, but there's a political mix-up, and so John has to return to England, and there's supposed to be this huge payment made to England. So it's a very, very agreeable bargain between the two sides, but nevertheless, the French king had been captured. From about 1367 to 1415, we have a period in which there wasn't really an active war. There was a lot of disruption, though, because, of course, the English held Gascony. And so along the Gascon frontier, there was a lot of turbulence. So southwestern France was disturbed. The other big problem, too, was that all sides were using mercenaries. And what the French discovered is that the mercenaries liked France. And often they were hired, they were known as free companies, but they wouldn't return home. And so when there were periods when there wasn't any active fighting, the mercenaries would go wild and pillage castles and really destabilize the countryside. So although we may not have an active period of fighting between England and France, France itself was disrupted by these free companies and these mercenaries that just wreaked havoc throughout the countryside. The next English offensive is 1415, and it's at Agincourt. And again, it's another huge English victory, similar to Crécy, where the English have a fortified position. The French have to try to scale it in the mud, in the rain, and are completely annihilated by the English forces. And in fact, it's so bad that the French agree to a peace agreement called the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. And according to the peace agreement, the king, Charles VI, actually disinherits his son and has his daughter marry Henry V of England. and their child will become king of a united England and France. That's the plan. But as it happens, that plan doesn't materialize, and that's largely due to the appearance of one woman, and that is Joan of Arc. And Joan of Arc hears voices, and they persuade her to go and find the Dauphin, or the Crown Prince of France, who would be Charles VII, who had been disinherited. And she's able to find him, and she persuades him to go to the city of Reims, and that's the traditional town where French kings are crowned. And she persuades him to go to Reims, where he is crowned. And then she proceeds to lead French armies into battle. Now, she hears voices, she dresses like a man, and she has some military success. That is, she defeats the English at the siege of the city of Orleans, often known as the Maid of Orleans. But she gives the French kind of this moral push because she hears voices, these divinely inspired voices, which tell her that God has sided with the French against the English. So she becomes a rallying point for proto-French nationalism. Now, in 1430, though, she's captured by the Burgundians, and they ransom her to the English, and Charles VII doesn't intervene. Now, he probably could have ransomed her, but instead what the English do is they place her on trial by the Inquisition. And this Inquisition was largely a state-controlled Inquisition that was determined of Joan's guilt in advance. So she's under trial by this state-controlled Inquisition. She's found guilty. She's condemned of innumerable charges. She hears voices. She leads an army. She's guilty of transvestitism. And she is burnt at the stake. But what she does is she gives the French this moral push. They've burnt our Joan. And the French now are rallied because Joan has become a rallying cry. The English, look how evil they are. They've even killed Joan. And so the French are able to take back English cities one by one by one by one. In the early 15th century, of course, the French have the introduction of artillery. And so we have cannons now, which make siege warfare much easier because you can simply, the cannons aren't very accurate, but if you're trying to hit a city wall, you'll do a pretty good job. And the French are able to take back cities one by one by one until 1453. The only English possession left in France is the city of Calais on the coast. So all of France is reclaimed by Charles VII. 25 years after she was burnt to the stake, an ecclesiastical court exonerated her. And then, of course, in 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized. But Joan gave the French the push that they needed, and in 1453, they liberated France from most of English control. Now, some of the byproducts of this 100 Years' War, though, is the French countryside's devastated. It will take France about 50 years to recover, and it's really not until the 1490s, 1500s, that France is in the state that it was in 1300, because all of the major battles were in French territory. So one of the legacies of the 100 Years' War is that we have a very long war between England and France, and that the French economy and countryside are disrupted for a very, very long period of time. And it's really not until the year 1500 that France, in the year 1300, France was the cultural leader of Europe. Cultural leadership will pass to Italy for about 200 years during the Italian Renaissance. Around 1500, though, France reclaims its title to European cultural leadership.
Well, now that we have learned about the later Middle Ages in Western civilization, when we come back for our next lecture, we will discuss the Renaissance. Very different topic. Things seem to be getting a lot better in Europe during this Renaissance time, and around 1500. We'll see, of course, a rebirth, a renaissance, a rebirth of learning and ancient societies and cultures. And this is all centered, this renaissance will be centered in a place called Italy. And when I say Italy, I don't mean the country of Italy unified under a prime minister that we have today. Italy is not unified. It will not be unified until the late 19th century. And Italy is a collection. They have different city-states. They have Florence, For example, you have the Papal States, you have Sicily, you have Milan. I mean, there's just a lot of different areas of Italy. So it's broken up. It's not your unified one country, one government place here during this period of the Renaissance. But overall, we do say Italy, and it does begin in Italy. And what better place for it to begin? I mean, you have the ruins of the Romans in your backyard. You have a lot of wealth in Italy at this time because a lot of the trade routes would come off the Italian coast. So when we come back, we'll of course focus on the Renaissance. Until next time.